In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Welcome to FemCity number 15, a livecast brought to you by Pakhuis de Zwijger in collaboration with the KAAP and Nederlands-Vlaams Cultuurhuis De Buren. Welcome to all viewers through Facebook, through the website of Pakhuis de Zwijger and through Zoom. It's great to have you all with us here today. My name is Hasna El Maroudi and I will be guiding you through the talks of today. FemCity is a series in which we explore societal issues and aim to create awareness on all these topics. We bring people together, form alliances, and organize talks, meetups, workshops. FemCity is an intersectional platform that puts gender equality at the forefront and offers spaces to talk, inspire, and activate to new voices. And today we're going to talk about the city. Not just Amsterdam, but cities everywhere. We do this along the work of author Leslie Kern. I have her book here with me. She writes about how we live in a city of men, man-made, we might say, and how our public spaces are not designed for women or by women. The streets are at times a place of threat rather than community, and gentrification has made the everyday lives of women, and especially low-income women, even more difficult. In Feminist City, Leslie exposes what is hidden in plain sight. The social inequalities built into our cities, homes, our neighborhoods, our communities. And today, Leslie will present her book, and she'll go into a conversation with a number of guests about what it means to claim space in a man-made world. After Leslie has given her short keynote on the book and on the importance of a feminist vision on the city, she'll go into the conversation with Sophie van Dam and Helene de Bruyne, who made the podcast Wilde Wijven. To those who were just in our virtual waiting room, you've listened to a short bit of that podcast. Subsequently, we'll have a panel discussion on how to upskill feminist vision on the city that already exists. And we'll do this with architect Afijna de Jong, Femke Awater, who is from Vrouwen van Nieuw-West, Leslie herself, and Caroline Combé, head of city planning. Throughout the program, but specifically after Leslie's talk and during the panel, we welcome you all to ask questions. You can do that through Zoom if you're watching through Pakhuis de Zwijger program page or by watching through Facebook live stream. Please do ask the questions. They'll come through here, and in that way you can engage with the conversation. So those were all my general notices. Let's start. Hi, Leslie.
Hello, thank you.
Hello. How are you? It's so good for you to join us today. Hope you're doing well.
I am. It's great to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you maybe give a short introduction of who you are, what you do? I know you're a feminist geographer, but when I read that, I was like, what is a feminist geographer?
It's a great question. Yes, so I'm a university professor at a small university on the east coast of Canada called Mount Allison University, and I work in a geography and environment department. My initial training was in women's and gender studies, but I became quite fascinated with questions of how women live in cities, their experiences of city life, and that led me to this thing called feminist geography, which I understand as ways of interrogating how power operates, not just through our social relations, but in concert with the built environment around us. So taking a feminist perspective on cities is a way of seeing how the spaces that we've designed, our mobilities through them, their histories and their futures impact things like gender relations.
Yeah, great. You've made a short presentation for us to introduce your work more to us, the book specifically. The digital floor, I have to say, is yours.
Great, thank you. So I believe, yes, that's great. Thank you for controlling the slides for me today. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from what is currently known as Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, but is the unceded Indigenous territory of the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people, where we are governed by treaties of peace and friendship here. The book Feminist City came out about a year ago, first in Canada, so prior to the pandemic happening. And so it's been really fascinating to have so many conversations about the book in these kind of unprecedented times. And it's really brought a new lens, I think, to some of the questions that I was asking in the book, and has opened up maybe for a wider audience who are suddenly confronted with questions about public space, about the home, about work in ways that they might not have been thinking about a year ago. So my purpose in writing the book was to introduce some of the kind of academic ideas of feminist geography to a wider audience, to make it accessible for a wider group of people to be able to look around their cities and say, oh, isn't this interesting? How did this building come to be here? Who is this space for? Who feels safe here and who feels excluded in these spaces? I've used in the book some of my own everyday embodied experiences as starting points for these conversations, not because my experience is universal, but because I think it's always helpful to kind of start from our own situation and then to say, how is the city working for me? If it's not working for me, who else is it not working for? So in that, I try to take an intersectional approach, which is to not just center the idea of a kind of universal woman, but to take into account that women's experiences are, of course, deeply inflected by other social positionings like race, class, sexuality, age, and ability. So the book is not so much a blueprint for the future, but it is, I think, kind of a vision or a set of principles that might guide us. And so those are some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So we can move to the next slide. So why the feminist city? Why start from this particular point? Well, one of the things that I try to make clear in the book is that issues of gender equity are still often an afterthought in many cities, especially when it comes to the importance of care labor. And I highlight care labor here because, again, with the pandemic, this is a topic that has bubbled up to the forefront of people's consciousness and understanding. Next slide, please. So during the COVID crisis, we have seen all sorts of ways in which a lot of gendered assumptions about who does what kind of work, where it's done, and how it's done are really baked into the everyday kind of policy making. So I show just a headline here from my home province of Ontario, where I used to live. Her kid had a stuffy nose. Now hers is one of many Ontario families in COVID testing limbo. And this refers to kids going back to school in September, and every time they had a runny nose, they had to go home from school, get a COVID test, wait for a negative response before they could go back to school. And I note here, her kid had a stuffy nose. Now hers is one of many Ontario families. And these kinds of headlines were always gendered. It was always women who were expected to then stay home from their own jobs to wait for their child to be able to go back to school. So this is just one little example of kind of how this played out, at least here in Canada. So the COVID crisis has highlighted the lack of gendered analysis in many cities and policymakers and even public health perspectives, I think, with respect to the home. So how is the form of the home working for people these days, right? What kind of family is the home designed for? And what kinds of functions has the home been set up to do? And what are we asking of it now in these particular times? We might ask also what the form of the home kind of hides. And one of those things is clearly care labor. It also hides a fair amount of violence that happens in the home, predominantly towards women and children. We've raised questions about public space in this time. How are we using our public spaces if we're all being asked to spend more time outdoors? Who are our urban public spaces accessible to, safe for, and comfortable for? And questions about work are also really important here. So the seeming divide between care work and paid or productive work has really collapsed, I think, in these times, and also has become a kind of crucial urban question. So moving on to the next slide, we can raise so many questions that we might ask, but here's just a few that we could pose as people who are interested in cities. We can ask, are our cities, homes, and buildings built to carry us through crisis? The COVID crisis is certainly not the only crisis we're facing, and there will be many more of different varieties to come. So how sustainable are our cities? How resilient are our cities? Part of that, we have to ask who and what are we relying on? And by this, I mean, whose labor is really kind of powering the city? Whose work is making it possible for this thing that we call the economy to continue to function? We also can ask what assumptions are underpinning these systems. So again, assumptions about gender, for example, assumptions about who does what kind of work and where that work might be happening. We have to ask whose voices have continued to be marginalized in conversations about the city. And finally, I think, what are our priorities? What are the most important things that we think of when we think of the function of a city? I think we've all heard a lot of talk about the economy, at least over here in North America. This is what we hear over and over again right now. But it raises the question, what is this economy and what's so important about it? How is it working out for people? And what about it exactly do we want to save? Okay, next slide, please. So part of what might be what we might need to kind of surface or bring to the surface as we're thinking through some of these questions would be what kinds of assumptions, social norms, biases, and so on are kind of lurking behind so many of the ways that we plan things, design things, intervene in public spaces. And as a feminist, we're always on the lookout for binaries, right? So we could talk about the gender binary or the presumed binary of gender. There's all sorts of other binaries or things that are set up as in opposition or fundamentally different from one another that I think the binaries themselves can be problematic, but they kind of continue to lurk there and structure the way that we do things. So I won't talk about all of these in detail. I just kind of raise them here for us to think about how, for example, an assumption that public space and private space are two completely separate things has really been kind of challenged and broken down in this COVID moment. And it's shown all the ways that this setup, first of all, this has not really functioned so clearly in the lives of many people, and that it has not really worked so well to support, for example, care labor. So these are just some of the ones that we could kind of unpack a little bit. And I think some of the principles that I'm going to talk about in the rest of my presentation are designed to maybe shake up or stir around these binaries a bit. Okay, next slide, please. So in envisioning a more feminist city, what sorts of principles or building blocks could we start with? And I say a more feminist city because I don't know that there is a perfect endpoint that we'll arrive at, but certainly there's a process that we can go through. So we'll go to the first one if you want to move the slide forward again. So the first principle that I like to talk about is the idea of margin to center. And what I'm getting at here is that so many groups in the city that have kind of been positioned as like minorities or special interest groups of some sort. So for example, disabled people, women, elderly people, and these are portrayed in some of the images on this slide. These have been thought of as like niche groups that if you design for the elderly, you're only designing for one small segment of society. Or if you design for disabled people, that's a particular niche area of design. But of course, if you take all of these supposed minority groups together, we are the majority, and the figure that has been set up as the normal urban citizen, the sort of able-bodied, middle-class, economically productive man, is perhaps a minority, or at least he is not the one who is in need of a fair amount of intervention and support. So I think if we start from the supposed margins and recenter that, which again, the groups that I think actually do constitute the majority of people in cities, first of all, that man, he'll be fine. If he won't suffer from a city being made more accessible, affordable, or anything like that. He'll be just fine. We don't need to worry too much about him. But the interventions that seem to target in a so-called niche group might actually be the things that create a much broader inclusivity around the city. Okay, next slide. The next principle is the idea that the symbolic matters. And I think this was really driven home for many people through the resurgent protests of Black Lives Matter throughout the summer of 2020, when things like different statues and monuments were toppled or defaced or graffitied in some way. One of the pictures here, we have a statue of Edward Cornwallis, who was a colonizer in Canada. This is from the city of Halifax. And after many protests by Indigenous people, his statue was finally hoisted away and put into storage. He famously called for a bounty on the scalps of Indigenous people in the Eastern Canada region. So I raise this because, while the symbolic might seem like a small piece of the puzzle of the city, it does convey to people the message of you belong or you don't belong. Your stories matter or they don't matter. Your history counts or it doesn't count. So even though it might seem like just a kind of a superficial layer, I think the symbolic is important for signaling different levels of inclusion and exclusion. And in many ways, if we're looking for things that are kind of practical and easy to do, some of these symbolic interventions are things that are quite simple to change. You can change the names of places, you can fly different flags, you can remove offensive monuments of genocidal colonizers, and this does make a difference in how people feel about their spaces. Okay, next slide. So with this principle, home inside out, what I'm trying to get at is, can we imagine ways to turn some of the work and functions of society that have been so invisible and hidden in the private space of the home, and can we bring them into the public sphere and collectivize them in some ways? So again, this is kind of interesting in the COVID moment when we are, again, being asked to be outside more, but this requires a kind of re-envisioning of what those public spaces are meant for. So can we imagine our parks and public squares as places where people are collectively fed, right? And not just in an expensive cafe with a plastic bubble around your little, middle-class family unit, but where the community can be fed. Can we imagine our urban public spaces as classrooms for children, right? Can we imagine these as care spaces where vulnerable members of the community can come to access social services, and not simply as places of like play and fun and consumption, which is how many urban public spaces have been conceptualized in recent years. And my hope in thinking about this is that some of that care labor that has disproportionately fallen to women in the private space of the home could be redistributed, could be made visible, could be made public, and could be then seen as valuable work that as a society we need to engage in together. All right, the next slide, please. So I'm going to make the very obvious statement here that people have bodies, yet this seemingly simple and obvious fact is something that seems to be ignored in a lot of design and urban space interventions. It's not perhaps the most glamorous reason to go to architecture school to think about designing a public toilet, for example. I don't think anybody imagines becoming a planner to design the perfect bench for the elderly to sit on or anything like that. Yet these are the kinds of things, in many ways, very simple things that make the city livable, accessible, and inclusive. So we all need places to rest, shade, shelter, water, food. We all need places to go to the toilet. We need toilets that are safe and that match our gender identity if they're going to be gendered toilets. And this is just the very sort of basic level of public service and space provision that allows different groups of people to actually be part of the public sphere. It comes as a shock to many people to realize that some people simply don't go out in public because they don't know if they will have a place to use the bathroom. And so this really limits, I think, even our potential for sort of democracy, because we are forcing some people to be hidden away in their home and to not be able to participate in public life. So we have to if we start from the body and think, how can we support people's most basic needs? Then I think inclusivity can follow from that. Okay, the next slide. So this is the last principle that I'll talk about today, and it kind of sums up all of the other ones, I think, which is questioning who and what is public space for? How can we put care at the center? So public space, I think, in recent years has been conceived of as how can we capitalize on it? How can we profit from it? How can we make it attractive for investment and developers and the middle class? But we haven't really asked questions about how we can create public spaces that encourage us to believe in our shared responsibilities to one another, to collectivize care work. And the image that I have in this slide is actually from before the pandemic. It's an image from my hometown of Toronto. And in it, you can see kind of a freeway, a highway overpass. And underneath this overpass, there used to be an encampment of homeless people who would sleep here. Well, the city removed the homeless people and then decided to offer an expensive bubble dining experience for middle-class people to happen in this space where homeless people had been removed from. And I think it's kind of like almost predicting what has happened in the pandemic, where we're now seeing public space taken over by these little privatized pods or expanded restaurant spaces and so on, but we're not really asking who can access these spaces, who are they for, and in doing this, who are we kind of pushing out of the city or pushing off of the streets? So those are some critical questions that I think we should raise. Okay, so the next slide, which is also my last slide to wrap up with today, is just my conclusion, a very simple conclusion that I think it's time for us to bring some of these things that have been made invisible, care work, gendered labor, the embodied nature of urban life, to bring them into the light, to bring them to the forefront. And I hope, when I'm feeling optimistic, I believe that this current crisis is actually a moment when we can start to do some of that work and perhaps to make some progressive changes in our cities. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wrote down a few things, among others, safety and accessibility. And there are a lot of different things that are necessary to create a city or a world that is accessible and well, basically just good for every one of us. And to me, growing up, I already always knew that the streets were kind of unsafe for me as a woman of color. And it only really reached a level of actually, I really got furious when I started running and I discovered that certain areas within the city I live in aren't safe for women running by themselves. So while my husband runs through nature, I always run past highways and stuff. So I was wondering, because you also said every day that you started from everyday experiences. I was wondering, like, was there for you this moment of an everyday experience that sparked your interest in this in this field?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I can certainly relate to feelings of a lack of safety in urban public spaces. But when I was a young person living in the city, I, attributed that to good old sexism and patriarchy. And I had never really thought about the way that the city itself was part of that. And for me, it was the experience of having a baby and then trying to navigate the city as a pregnant person and as a parent with a newborn that made me realize that the form and function of the city was very much not set up to support me being out in public or trying to go about my day-to-day life with a small child. Everything from just trying to get on public transportation to getting in and out of shops to the way that people would treat me and my child in public space as though we were, an intrusion on their sort of right to whatever they thought the public space was for, started to spark in me this thought that, the city itself is not really set up for me now. It had been relatively accessible to me, even with these moments of harassment and fear, but now it's like, no, you don't really belong here anymore. So that was one of those personal moments that led me towards finding this world of feminist geography.
Yeah, that's so relatable. I was wondering also if there are other elements within the cities that show us the dominance of this male vision, because I call it a male vision. Maybe you think of it differently, but I feel that in a way, this male vision on what structures the city should be made of is what makes that there are that the doors are maybe too small, so you can push your stroller through, etc. Are there other elements that you can specify?
I do agree that there is a male vision, or at least a set of predominantly male experiences that have structured the way that those who design, plan, fund, and build our cities have gone about it. So in many ways, the mobility aspects of cities, everything from public transit to cars and freeways, have been set up to, bring a breadwinner, a male breadwinner from the home in the suburbs or the residential community into the central city to work in this kind of linear journey in ways that feel very safe and comfortable and easy for that person, but they have not been set up to take into account the way that women tend to move through the city, which involves more burdens of care work, taking children to and from school, picking up dinner on the way home, taking someone to a doctor's appointment. And so women have found that just the mobility functions of the city are not really set up to take into account all of that kind of care labor. So that's one example that is quite common. And issues of safety as well, where for many decades, women activists have had to push for very basic things like lighting and good sight lines and public safety programs and all of these sorts of things, because women's experiences of public city life were assumed to be again, kind of an afterthought or not something that was really central to how we need to set up the city.
Yeah, the sidewalks in my neighborhood, some are super wide, and especially now during this pandemic, there are also very small ones, and I often think, well, something went wrong here while they were creating this street, because they gave so much space to all the cars and so little to us women walking around here, and basically it's impossible to keep some distance. To the people watching the live stream, if you have any questions for Leslie, please do ask them, and then I'll get them in, and then we can take you with us, and you can join the conversation. I think it's time now to go into the conversation with our other panelists about the instances of the man-made world. Joining us are Helene de Bruyne, podcast and radio maker and author of The Planstrekkers, and Sophie van Damme, also podcast maker, lecturer at School of Art Ghent and founder of the Letterie. You're both joining us via Zoom today, all the way from Belgium.
Hi.
Hi, hello. Before we start the conversation, we have a small clip from your podcast that I would like to listen to, so we can dive into the conversation a little bit deeper.
Okay.
Pas de téléphone, non.
Qu'on va boire un verre ensemble ou quoi?
Non, merci.
Chez moi à la maison, bien sûr, pas dans un café. L'hôtel, le lit, tu connais direct.
Vous comprenez pas? Je veux pas.
Si tu me donnes envie, c'est normal, non?
Alors, petit fait-fesse.
Petit fait-fesse. Chienne. Salaud.
Dat was een fragment uit Femme de la Rue, de documentaire waarmee Sophie Peters ontzettend veel heisa heeft veroorzaakt. Ze liet zien hoe het is om als vrouw in bepaalde wijken over straat te lopen.
Ja, ik herinner mij die documentaire nog bij verschijnen. Het was, mijn vriendinnen hadden het over niets anders meer op café toen, want iedereen vond het erg herkenbaar.
Heel veel vrouwen durven de straat niet op. En er zijn natuurlijk ook in dat verband al heel veel initiatieven genomen om pleintjes visueel aantrekkelijker te maken voor vrouwen. Geen donkere hoekjes en steegjes meer, enzovoort, enzovoort. Maar Hilde Heijnen heeft daar haar bedenkingen bij.
Wat mij ongelooflijk frappeert, maar ik deel de bezorgdheid en het persoonlijke aanvoelen van veiligheid is enorm belangrijk. Maar wat mij ongelooflijk frappeert, is het de disconnect, het gebrek aan verband tussen de reële risico's, het gevoel van onveiligheid. Eigenlijk als we naar de cijfers kijken, wij zouden ons met ons allen als vrouwen onveilig moeten voelen. Daar gebeuren de meeste verkrachtingen door bekenden, door partners, daar. Op basis van de objectieve gegevens zouden we eigenlijk veel meer schrik moeten hebben binnenshuis dan buitenshuis. Dat hebben we niet. Op basis van objectieve gegevens hebben jongens bijna evenveel redenen als meisjes om zich onveilig te voelen in de publieke ruimte, wegens vechtpartijen en slagen en verwondingen, waar zij veel meer slachtoffer van zijn dan meisjes. De reden is dat wij als meisjes ongelooflijk gesocialiseerd zijn om onszelf te beschermen. Maar dat is niet alleen onszelf. Als er iets met ons lichaam gebeurt, dat is niet alleen onze zaak, maar dat is ook de zaak van onze familie. Dat is niet alleen een islamitische overtuiging. Dat was tot in de jaren 50 ook, 60, 70, ook bij ons. Dat zit dus ook in onze geschiedenis, dus we moeten niet doen als...
Yes, you just heard a fragment from Wilde Wijven podcast, made by you, Helene and Sophie. This episode is called Sexen and the City, and I was just wondering why you chose this specific topic.
You mean women and the city?
Oh, it says Sexen and the City.
It comes down to women and the city. I know the binaries are mostly created, but in the heads of people they are still there, and that's how they categorize things. So I think in that way they are real. So that's why, etc. But anyway, it's because in our podcast we search for like the hidden norms and the things in the daily life that you're not really aware of all the time. But when you look deeper into it, or when you delve deeper into it, you can see that there is a gendered structure at work, right, Sophie?
Yes, and the self-evidences of hidden norms we would like to show and to unfold and to discuss about it without having the idea that we know how it should be. Yeah? We are just hearing different voices and we like to put the issue down.
Yeah, well, the first episode we did was about the home and work in the house, and care work is also a big part of that. So that goes together a bit with the public sphere and the city. So I think it's from there from the home that we landed in the public sphere. But as Leslie just explained, those two things are very connected. Care work and the public sphere, or well, not as well connected as they should be. But anyway.
Were there some new things you learned while making the podcast, or some new insights you got?
The fragment we just heard, for us, that was the most striking.
It was a bit of a revelation for me, actually. Because you heard Hilde Heijnen say, she said it like, everybody feels unsafe. It's very recognizable for everybody. Every female identifying person I know, that they walk on the streets and they feel unsafe. But actually, indeed, when you look at the numbers, the streets aren't all that unsafe, and it's a lot better now than it was, like, for instance, in the beginning of the century, say. So where is that fear coming from? It's inside our heads, but what are the hidden norms that make us so afraid? And what is the role of men on the street? What is the role of women themselves?
Yeah. Especially the way we used to, as Leslie in her book explains, the key issue is socialization, of course. And you cannot change that from one day to another, but being aware of that's at least a start.
But that's a bit of the thing we always end up with when we do research for these podcasts. It's like nowadays we have, legally, we have equal rights, on paper at least. But then everything now that you touch upon, like in the workplace, care work that is underpaid or not paid or and not even appreciated, all these things people say as a counter argument to feminists. They always say, but it's free choice, it's free will. So that's a bit, I think, the difficult thing here.
Yeah, and what we like to explore is the hidden mechanism behind such so-called equal equalities between men and women.
Yeah, and when talking about
women who are deprived, because as Hilde Heine also said, there's more aggressivity towards men than towards women in the public space.
Yeah.
Because men easily fight or getting aggressive more easily. And
plus there's the racial issue here. The documentary you heard a part from was in French, and that was a very big hit here in Belgium because it was the first time in 2012 that a woman filmed how it was to walk on the streets, and all these men coming up to her saying, hey, do you want to come up to my room, blah, blah, blah. And if she said no, they called her slut. All these men are actually colored. So we were, when I first saw it, was like, well, this is interesting because it could be, you can see that people who have racist intentions can use the documentary that shows a real problem, can use it in the wrong way.
Yeah, I remember the documentary Femme de la Rue. It sparked quite the conversation about safety on the streets and especially in certain neighborhoods. But when we talk about this sense of unsafety, because as you said, Helene, it's not always actually that people are actually unsafe. What are the battles that we can, like? What are the ways to battle this? Is it a change of mind that has to happen within us, or is it something that has to happen within the structures of society in total? Or can we zoom into certain neighborhoods and say, okay, if we change these neighborhoods or the way they are made up? And also, Leslie, I would also like you to answer the question as well.
You want to start, Leslie? Do you have the solution for this big problem here?
Oh, if only I did. And because this is a complex, especially in the city, it's a complex interplay of social forces and some environmental physical forces. If we could design out crime, fear of crime, violence against women, I would like to think we would have already done it, if it was just a matter of reshaping the physical environment. But of course, we can't quite design out patriarchy, I don't think. That's not going to be the only way to do it. But you're right that the question of socialization is very important. Women do experience harassment on the street that even if it doesn't turn into physical assault, reminds us, like, you don't really belong here. Something bad could happen to you at any moment. And I think we also have to keep in mind that sort of encouraging women to feel afraid in public space really does support the invisibility of domestic violence. So we kind of keep that hidden because we focus all our attention on public violence and fear of violence. So keeps domestic violence stigmatized, hidden. We don't want to talk about it. And it also keeps us looking to the home and the family and the traditional patriarchal family as a site of safety, even though, as you point out, it's by the numbers, it isn't. But of course, that upholds the status quo very well. It keeps women in that position of doing so much of the care work in the private home. Like, there's a kind of a deeper level of social function to...
Yeah, I think for me personally, it's work to take space on the street, but then I have I'm quite tall, and it's easier, I think, if you to do that as women. So I don't want to give other women the responsibility to do what I do. Like I just go on the street and take the space, and then everything will be fine. You just have to be more assertive, or take a course in assertivity or self-defense and just go out there. That's not the solution. I think it might help for some women to feel safer when they go out if they do that, if they try to be more assertive. But I think they need to be given space as well by the men on the street. How we will ask them that, I don't know. And then there's indeed the layout of the streets, but Hilde Heenen pointed out that a few more street lights will not help. Because indeed it's a whole patriarchal structure that's very much in all of our heads.
Yeah, and I think it's important for in education, and with regard to the COVID, there are two things. The first is that it's as we weren't on the streets, it has been said more explicitly how much domestic violence there is. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, and that's a bad consequence of the COVID, even children are raised with more fear for everything. And we have to keep distance, and we have to be seen. And that is something that is throwing us back in the inclusion, I think.
We have a question from the audience. Anna, it's more of a comment, not necessarily a question, but I think you can still reflect on it. She says, what I read in the literature is that starting the conversation between groups might be able to help. So between scared women and youngsters hanging in the streets. Is that something you know of? Is that something you would applaud?
The so-called street workers are trying to make a link.
It also specifies certain youngsters as the people on the street that are harming or making the streets more.
Because they are hanging around.
Yeah. And then you have the racist issue again, and it's also a socio-economic issue, because who is hanging out on the streets? People who have a harder time finding a job. Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, I think for me it works to talk with these people when I'm harassed, and then sometimes it turns into a productive conversation, or at least an interesting conversation. But again, I don't want to just tell everybody go out and do that, because you need time and effort, and if you feel like doing that, it's not your responsibility.
Yeah,
I think that's also the different groups. That's also a matter of having place. As long as if they don't have a place, of course they are hanging around, and we should, as a society, give young people place.
And what's wrong with hanging around in the streets?
Yeah. And well, when we talk about offering spaces, whether it is to women or to young people, and the way cities are designed and planned nowadays, would you say that maybe they should get more of a voice planning the cities? Or
there are more and more participative projects, but there again, you have to approach as intersectional, because if not, then who will not join the public hearings with regard to the urbanization plans? People who have women, because they have to take care for the children, and the middle upper class will join that meetings, and it's much more difficult to reach some other groups. Those who need it most.
And also on the level of the planners themselves, we spoke to Hilde Heenen, who is a teacher at the Department of Architecture in Leuven. You were there also on the podcast. And she said, like, I have so many brilliant female students. They are all doing very well. When you look at the level of the masters, they're very well represented. When you look at the higher up levels, the women just disappear from the ranks of the planners and the architects. And and then we come to the care work again. That's the time of their life when they start having children and start doing care work. And then they just drop out of the out of the entire very competitive world of planning and architecture. Yeah. So that's a problem also.
Yeah, more on that in my next panel. But before I move on to that panel, I would like to ask Leslie the last question from the audience. It's regarding women's mobility during COVID-19. Do you know of any good practice examples from cities taking the pandemic as a chance to make urban mobility more gender equal and inclusive for everyone? So are there any good practices or examples? Leslie.
Well, on the positive side, I think that some cities did move to pedestrianize areas or to increase bike lane access, which is not specifically a gendered intervention, but anything that kind of cuts back on the space that cars take up, I think overall has the potential to be a good gendered intervention. Unfortunately, one of the things that I've noticed, especially here in parts of the world that are about to enter winter and have a lot of snow, is that many cities, due to budgetary reasons, have decided that they're not going to plow sidewalks, right? They're not going to clear snow from sidewalks. And this is a very gendered issue in terms of like how people can move around, and again puts a lot of primacy on kind of the car and mass transportation without recognizing that elderly people, disabled people, women, anyone pushing a cart full of groceries, delivery people, we all need access to the sidewalk. So I'm kind of concerned about that development.
Yes, I don't know how to push a stroller through, I don't know how much snow that would be. Thank you so much, Sophie van Damme and Helene de Bruin, for joining us in this conversation. We're going to move on to the next panel. And this one is about responding to a feminist vision from different perspectives. Joining Leslie and I today are Caroline Combé, Afijna de Jong, founder and director of Amsterdam-based architectural agency Afarij. Femke Awater is here with me. I'm so happy to have you sitting here at the table. You're a project manager of Women of New West. Welcome, everyone. So good to see all the beautiful faces. First of all, Afijna, you're an architect in residence at Arcom at the moment, and you've initiated a book club, and this is one of the books that you're actually reading or you've already read, Feminist City. I was wondering why you find it so important, also coming from your field of work, why this book is on the list.
Well, I mean, I compiled a must-read list of 10 publications. And this was one of the books I came across this summer when I was having my vacation. And I'm very happy that this book exists because it raises a lot of issues that I deal with on a regular basis in my work.
Can you give me an example?
Everything. Yeah, you know, like who gets to use public space? What's up with the bodies? Some bodies are conceived as space invaders. Yeah, you know, there's so much, this whole lens, like the universal person that we're designing for as architects, like it just doesn't make any sense. Well, I mean, yeah, a lot of it, what can I say? You know, I think there should be more women offices commissioned to design public spaces. I think I loved how Leslie framed it, that, you know, it's always like, oh, you're designing for a niche, but actually all the niches together are the majority, you know. That is something that I try to point out everywhere I go. And it's also something that I practice within my field, you know, like I'm working on this pavilion in Sweden. And I just said, look, I only want to talk to women of all ages, of all walks of life. And I just want to know, like, what this public space should be for them, you know. And it's so interesting because, like Leslie points out, you know, it's very easy. Like, it immediately is about safety. But then after that, you get into how women actually perceive space and how they can connect to it, because they know that the spaces that they inhabit are designed by men. And basically that women have to inhabit spaces in which men, you know, think what we would like. But if they would have even considered it at first, you know. But imagine you're like a teenage kid and you have to go to there's a community center or a playground, and that playground is basically the perception of an old white man of what they would like, and it's just not competing, you know, like it's not the same thing. It's and so for me it was very interesting, and I just acted as if the woman in that specific city was like the universal user, you know, like we're just gonna turn it around. Your world is now the universe. And then you just end up with something different instead of something that is white or gray or square or I don't know. Yeah.
Karine Combe, you're also with us here today, and you're the head of city planning. How do you... No. You're joining us today instead of the elder man.
I don't even know if I would want to be. I don't even know if I would want to be. No, I'm one of the head planners of the city of Amsterdam. Yeah. I'm not the head of the planning department.
Okay. So what's the difference?
The head of the planning department would be our director. Our new director, who is a woman, by the way.
Yeah. Well, when you listen to Afina and what she just told about this universal person somehow that cities are built for or planned around, what kind of universal person do you envision?
Well, that's almost like a person with no characteristics at all. I think mostly in the past we've envisioned men. That's true. But I also know that in the last decade, slowly, things also changed. When I look at my colleagues, for example, at the planning department in Amsterdam, and we might be an exception when we have one exceptionally large planning department with lots of specialities, which is really unique in the world. Great designers, and more than half of them are women.
And there's also this initiative called Women Make the City.
Exactly, yeah.
Can you shortly explain?
Sorry, I would have been lovely if our alderman could have been here, but unfortunately she is detained in a council meeting where she has to be. And she was very inspired and came up with the idea of like a women advisory board, which was once a one-time event, but will be made in a longer-term event now, because we're working on a long-term vision and strategy on the spatial planning and the environment for the city of Amsterdam for 2050. And what we did we did not make it the whole vision first and then asked women about it. No, from the start, we asked them to think with us. And what we did was invite women from all walks of life, from the New West and Southeast and Northern part of Amsterdam, women who already had very strong social networks, and I admire all of them, they're amazing. And we asked them, if we write something, and every step of the way, can you look at what we've done and give us your opinion? And they did. And they're really good at not only seeing what's necessary in their own neighborhoods, but for the city as a whole. They're very good at looking at the complex matters and making very straightforward advices, which have helped us a lot in looking at the city.
Yeah, is there a specific example you can point out that really opened your eyes, so to say?
Interesting is maybe not for me because I'm a woman, and although it has been a very long time ago during my studies, I even did a gender studies special. 35 years ago, it was already a hot topic. But I think for a few of my colleagues in the male college, it was. But they made a list of like 10 advices for us, and the one thing that struck me the most, and especially in this pandemic, is create meeting spaces for everybody and create accessible meeting spaces, create spaces not only outside in public space where it is safe to see each other, meet up spontaneously or on purpose, maybe have shelter under a tree or have a table somewhere. The little things in public space that matter a lot, but also meeting spaces inside. Mm-hmm. We are troubled sometimes by closing special services inside, but keep them open, because that's where people meet. That's where people meet others. They create chances for each other, mm-hmm. build up a future. So, and they see how important those spaces are for all ages and all genders.
Beautiful to open up some eyes. Femke, you're here with me today. Yes. You work for Women of New West. Can you tell us something about the project that you're into now?
Yeah, actually the project is closing. We've been, it's a collaboration of Pakhuis de Zwijger, so this venue and Amsterdam Museum where I work now. And it was a project that started about 2.5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think it really started because both of the organizations, Pakhuis de Zwijger and Amsterdam Museum, are organizations that tell stories about the city and about the way you create a city. And often what we know, and luckily we're getting to know even more, is that we don't know all the stories. There's a lot of stories missing, mm-hmm. not only in our history, but also in the way that we create our cities today. We were both the organizations were working in the district of New West. It's the largest district of the city. It's a very diverse district, and it's this district with the most organizations for women. Mm-hmm. So that's women's groups, sports groups, but also emancipation centers, stuff like that. But actually, when you look at the history of this district, mm-hmm. you know, there's no perspective on the perspective of women is missing. Mm-hmm. And that's where we started the project. Let's find out who these women are. You see some of the pictures that were taken during the project, and I think we started by asking all these different women groups, what is it that you want to show us? What's the story that you want to tell? Mm-hmm. And when we first came there, I remember there was a big table with all these different groups together with us. And we asked them, so we want to create a network of women, and they were all just closing their arms, and they were saying, you want to create a network for us? We already have a network. We know each other. The problem is you don't know us. Mm-hmm. And that's where we started really together with them in a process of co-creation. Mm-hmm. We invited them to take workshops of photography and storytelling. And little steps, we created different exhibitions in a lot of the local spaces. Then we made an exhibition, an outdoor exhibition, mm-hmm. and that was very powerful because that way they really claimed their space on different squares, in different squares in the city, and also we took that exhibition and we took it from New West and we took it in the city center, mm-hmm. and I think that way we also made their stories more known, mm-hmm. and that was also something that they really wanted.
Yeah. And why was it so important for you to in light also of what we are talking about here today, to create that visibility?
Yeah, I think for them, because this is not something that I came up with or that that's really something that they themselves mm-hmm. decided.
They wanted to be more visible.
Yeah, they wanted to be more visible also because I think for them, they don't recognize themselves when they go to the museums very often. They don't recognize themselves when they open a newspaper or when they go to a theater. I think this is very important when you want to share the perspective. When you recognize yourself, you feel you have a power, you have a saying in the city. And I think for them, a lot of these women that we spoke to, they don't. When you ask them, what do you want to change in the neighborhood? Because it was one of the questions that it was very connected to the way we create our city. And very often they didn't really feel like they had to say it, so they didn't think about it. But when you ask them, and then of course so I think visibility is the beginning for them to be seen, and then for them also to feel like they have a say.
Yeah, to be recognized. Yeah, that's nice. Afena, hi, I'm going to come back to you just a second. I wanted to know how you design feminist cities. You already said a little bit about how you're designing now, and that you only want to talk to women of all ages and of all sorts. But if you would have to design the best feminist city, how would you go about it?
Well, I mean, I'm not an urban planner. I'm an architect. So that's a big difference. But I definitely, I do think about the city, and I design spaces, and whether they can be outside or they can be inside. Or, and my special interest is in public spaces, because that is, of course, where we all come together, in theory. But it's also the public spaces say something about our national identity. You know, it says something about who we are or who we want to be seen as. So, I mean, how to design the best feminist city, to me, is not only to talk to women, but talk to all of these groups that have been marginalized in some way. And that's why I really like the kind of intersectional framework, you know, because it like Leslie also said, it forces you to go beyond this universal idea of, you know, the little Vitruvius man.
Yes, but I can also imagine that there are certain elements that are very necessary for a city to be inclusive. So let's move past the word feminist, maybe, or let's call it intersectional feminist. For spaces, whether they are inside or outside, to be inclusive, there have to be certain standards that have to be met.
Yeah,
what would you think of?
I think when you talk about I like this idea of the feminist city, but it's just that we have to apply these ideas to all layers of society, right? So then when we arrive at architecture, it all of a sudden becomes really concrete. Like, okay, but what does that look like? How does that exactly work?
How many bricks do we need?
Is it even bricks, or should it be soft, you know? And that is, sometimes I find that difficult, but what I really try to do is question my position as a designer, as an architect, you know, like, what is my relation to power, you know, and how, and often we have these participatory processes that are actually not really participatory, you know, because in the end, as an architect, we still want to make something that we like. So also in that, I try to question myself and try to not only be someone who interprets, but also who really can be a translator of this kind of really specific world that we live in now, this really complex world with lots of very layered identities. And what does that look like? You know, and I'm also just testing that and trying to see. But I do think that it's very weird that we live in a very complex, in a city that's complex, that has complex identities, but that the architecture that we have is kind of becoming more and more generic. Like everything is becoming kind of glass and kind of the same color, and it's just such a contradiction. So I feel like the perfect feminist or inclusive city would be super specific. Like we have to question our positions, our position to power, accessibility, who is there, who gets to be there, you know. And to do that, we have to kind of deconstruct like our whole way of thinking, you know. Because when I went to architecture school, I didn't have female teachers. When I was teaching in architecture school, I was the only Black woman there. You know? And then I didn't know anything about like Dutch female architects from the past. I had to discover that by myself. At the same time, like the whole idea of what beauty is Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. So, I mean, it's so much to kind of deconstruct and free ourselves from if we want to design this feminist city.
Yeah, I can also imagine that that connectivity is somehow important to, like Femke, also what you're doing is showing the world and connecting people to other people that they might not always encounter. I have a question for you, Femke, and Caroline also, is if women of the New West and women make the city can be connected, and how you could help each other Caroline, let's start with you.
It's already connected.
It's already connected.
Yes, I don't know
How
if
is it
Caroline
connected?
noticed. Yeah, I was invited in the very beginning of Women Make the City, when it hadn't started yet. If we could share our network, if I knew women, I was a part in the initial few meetings that they had, and a lot of the women that were part of our project are now also women in the council that Caroline was talking about in the Women Make the City. There is a lot of overlap, so I've been following it very closely, and it's a very nice. It's one of the things that the project really did, and that's also, I think, the answer to your question: why is visibility important?
Yeah.
Because we showed these women, they were known by the municipality, and they took it to the next level. And this is, I think, what the project has done in many ways. Also because there's also a little council right now, which is called the Women Agenda Group of New West, which is also together with the municipality, and it gives counsel on a smaller level even. So I think so it's been connected.
Yeah. So that's good news, Caroline.
It definitely is, and which is good news also because, like Femke said, it's also use wisely the women that have knowledge and have networks, and by using their networks and asking them, can you bring in your networks? Because as a city official, it's not often that you see everybody. Not everybody is visible, and I think it's our task to look for them, to visit them, to go to them. But one of the things that helps is if other people with their networks can help us to give access and so that their voices can definitely be heard all over the place. One of the nice things we're doing now is in Amsterdam Southeast, the Women Advisory Board is having a new task there and being asked to advise on projects over there. And we have a office area that's being, in the last few years and more being changed into a mixed-use area. And it's a traditional office area. There are no sidewalks, for example. A lot still has to change. And they went in and met with the project group and advised. And also for them, it was an eye-opener. Yeah. Even if they're really good professionals, it still was an eye-opener, like we all know.
Yeah, we can learn
so
every day.
I'm very glad they can continue to do their work.
Yeah. And Leslie, can you maybe respond to everything you've heard so far? Are you excited?
Yes, thank you. There's been so many interesting points. I definitely agree with the points that have been made about participation and how that happens. I think too often communities, especially more marginalized groups, feel either that they aren't consulted or that it's very superficial, that it's just a hoop that a developer or a planner has to jump through, and it's not really meaningful. So Carolyn saying, we're trying to involve people from not bringing them a plan and saying, what do you like about it, but starting even earlier in the process. And that's slower. It takes longer. It takes more time and money. It's messier. You get contradictory information, but it's so important for people to feel that they have a voice, even if not everything turns out the way that they want it to. And I think that is also connected to this concept of sort of starting from the margins. If we think about any kind of space, if we imagine what would make this space inclusive to a single mother, a recent immigrant, a sex worker, a person experiencing homelessness, the safety element, the inclusive element kind of trickles up from there. Whereas I think too often people are kind of asked to design spaces that will keep out certain groups, right? To say, like, how can this be, how are we going to make sure that homeless people don't use this space, for example? And I realize this is a complex problem, but maybe if we don't start from who are we shutting out, if we kind of try to reverse the lens there, that might shift our way of thinking and doing things.
I agree. I hear you and well, all of you, but at the same time, when I hear people talk about giving voices to people or bringing other voices in, on the one hand, I get excited because I think it brings new perspectives, but at the same time, well, all fun and games, the actual power, the executive power to change things within society lies elsewhere.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's a problem, you know, because I mean, it's very nice. I have designed public spaces for men who are hanging out, who are unwanted, and it's very cool to do like this participatory process, and then you finally have a design, and then you go back to the municipality like, look, this is what they want, this is what we think is great, and it would work for everyone. And then it's like, yeah, but why would we make this for them? We can just put a bench there, you know? So, I mean, it's very nice. Sometimes these projects work on like a certain level, you know, but once they have to move up the ladder, then it becomes a whole different ballgame, because it's like, but are these people, do we even want to invest in these people? You know, like actually there's a bigger plan for this area, and I don't know if this is really a priority, you know. And that is, I mean, like Leslie was saying, like quite often I get design assignments that are kind of anti-architecture, you know, like it's framed as if you're doing like a beautiful design for a place, but it's actually a beautiful design for a place for all the new people, for all the people that we do want, and like a space that has to change so other people, the others, cannot use it, you know, or we don't want them to use it anymore. So I really think it's like Leslie saying, it's you have to change the thinking about this on executive levels has to change. And how do you do that if women do not go through to the highest echelons, or even not only women, but people from other like groups that are kind of like not in power. So it remains like a power question, and you know that's why we're dealing with intersectional thought, because it all relates to your position.
So it's definitely also about who do we prioritize.
Yeah, and who has the power? So I mean, who has the power to prioritize this? You know.
Yeah, Leslie, you're nodding.
Yeah, I am. Yes. No, I agree. I mean, I think sometimes you do kind of have to follow the money, as they say, like in terms of where the most kind of powerful influences are coming from, and even to a certain extent, the power of local government and the state is not what we think it is or hope it might be. There's a lot of, you know, powerful corporate and private interests that are shaping our cities in ways to, you know, maximize kind of profitability and things like this. So it's, it's not even just a question of, you know, more women architects, more people of color as architects. There's also like a bigger structural problem about, I guess we could say, the capitalist patriarchal city.
Yeah. Fina, and actually all of you, in short, because we're running out of time, there's a last question coming from the audience. What is the role, or can the role be, for social workers or social organizations in the cities, and how do you connect the lived experience with the policymakers and the planners? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, I would like to weigh in, because we worked with a lot of community centers and a lot of centers in US, and I think it was the most powerful. They're the most important institutes for a lot of women there. They're more important than than the municipality. In a lot of ways, they reach them way before. And what I find very interesting is that all of these women that I worked with, and also different people, because it's not only women, but none of them call themselves feminists. So if you talk about a feminist city, I think they're all working on emancipation of women, but none of them call themselves feminists. And I think there is this describes very well the huge gap that we have, because these women, they work with women on the emancipation of women, and they don't really feel like they have the power to say something on a bigger level.
Yeah,
I think that's where the change has to come. where we have to change.
I have one actual last question coming from the back here. Caroline, what will you tell the aldermen about this meeting? So the visions you've heard today, the stories you've heard, the demand for executive power.
Well, I don't have to convince her of anything. I'm quite sure she would very much agree with the things that have been said here and the statements that have been made. I would encourage her, but I'm not really doubting that she won't, to continue with our Women Make the City board, to continue working with networks, and to continue to include all these different views and needs from all these different kind of people from the start in a planning process, in any process, like Afina has been describing as well. Start straight away. And Leslie said it might be messy, or chaotic, but at the same time, that's my personal belief, is that in the end you're saving a lot of time and money, because there's a lot of times we're redoing plans because people. There's a strong, people are strongly objecting to the plans because they're not for them.
Yeah.
So I think you make better plans and you save money and time by starting to work with everybody, which can be complex, but will give us way better results.
Yeah, and the city
and
is
I will
ours.
say that to the alderman, and that's one thing I will definitely bring to her. And it's not just about women.
Yeah.
I like what Leslie says, it's about all those groups that are less visible, but together they make up the whole city.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all to my guests, to the people watching from home, from work, from wherever you are at the moment. You can buy Leslie's book at your local bookstore. It's over here. We know for a fact that the American bookstore here in Amsterdam has it. This was a co-production of Pakhuis de Zwijger, De Kaap and De Buren. And this was also the 15th edition already of the series FemCity. Please feel free to hang on. You can listen to the podcast Wilde Wijven. Or you can find it in your favorite podcast app if you need to get on the go. We'll be back in 2 weeks on this channel with the last edition of FemCity. This one will be called My Body, My Choice, before winter break. Same day, different time, 6:30 to 7:30. On this edition, we'll talk about abortion rights in Poland, on our own changing legislation on sexual assault, and about violence towards gay and trans people on the streets. Check out the Pakhuis de Zwijger website for the full agenda. Have a good evening, stay healthy, and see you next time.